Hello and welcome everyone. Today I want to show you how to craft a powerful high-end bow for physical blink arrow builds. And after that I'm going to show you how to craft powerful quivers. These quivers aren't specific to blink arrow builds or physical blink arrow builds for that matter. Instead they can be utilized for any crit-based bow build. Now for the bow, you want to start out with a spine bow for the high budget craft. For the medium budget craft, I used a assassin's bow. These tend to be a bit cheaper because we also need fractured attack speed. But yeah, as I said, for the high end version, go with the spine bow. Item level doesn't have to be higher than 83. And you want to start out with the attack speed modifier. You can go ahead and just get a 19% one. At least in this league, they tend to be pretty cheap. Now, in Necropolis League, we also get something special. We don't just get one fractured modifier, instead we get two. Since this is supposed to be for a physical build, what we obviously want to have is this tier 1 flat added physical damage. So if you have access to doubled fractured items, absolutely go ahead and get this double fractured bow. I bought mine from trade for 10 divines. Not sure how many bases there are for this, but in general, even if you can't buy one, you could make one with the Necropolis league mechanic yourself. Now, if you play this in a league where the Necropolis mechanic is no longer in place and you don't have access to double fractured bases, then by all means just start out with the fractured attack speed. And the same is of course true for the medium budget version. The main difference here is the first step, because what we want to do is we want to roll this item with Essences of Fear. For the medium budget approach, I recommend using Shrieking, not Deafening Essences, because it's cheaper and because you're going to have to repeat this step a couple of times, right? The first thing you would do if you don't have this double fracture is you would roll with Essences of Fear for one of the various tiers of flat added physical damage. For the medium budget, I would recommend tier 5 or tier 4, that's what I went with. If you want to craft a high-end bow in a league where you don't have access to a double fracture, I recommend not overshooting here, right? Go for tier 3s, go for tier 2s, because you will have to repeat this step a couple of times. Now, if you have access to a double fracture, like we have in the Necropolis League, then all we have to really roll for is an open prefix and an open suffix. The next step is also not that complicated, but it has to be repeated a couple of times and is sadly also a bit expensive these days. You have to craft prefixes, cannot be changed, and then roll the item with a Veiled Orb. When I originally conceived this build, we still had Veiled Chaos Orbs, which were obviously much cheaper. These days we only have the Veiled Orbs, which are more expensive. Yeah, sadly there is no way around this. I tried a dozen or so iterations of different crafting techniques and different bows with different modifiers, but we simply rely on the version of the weapon with the physical and impale chance. Now, in Craft of Exile, this is still the Ashling Slam, it hasn't been changed, right? But in-game, you would just use a Veiled Orb. Now, you can get suffixes, and when you get suffixes, you can essentially just redo the first step, right? As I said, with the double fracture, much cheaper than it is without that one. But, yeah, you might not have access to that. Which is why I also recommend not overshooting here. Tier 3, Tier 2, and then craft. So if we get a Veil prefix, the good thing is we're always going to get a physical damage modifier. The bad thing is there are 4 physical damage mods that are identical in terms of physical damage, but differ in the chance to, well, inflict something else. The version that we actually want is the Impale. Now, for a medium budget craft, you would absolutely take this. I did it the exact same way. I ended up with Blind, I think, which is actually the second most useful for physical blink arrow builds. Poison and bleeding, sadly, are pretty useless. And once again, just like if you were to get a suffix, you would have to repeat this step until you actually get the Impale. As I mentioned before, this is a bit expensive these days. In general, I recommend doing this craft earlier in the league when the Veiled Orbs are still a bit cheaper. Now, I don't want to do this back and forth, right? But you think you get the gist of it. Eventually, you're going to hit the physical damage and impale chance. Now, the next step is fairly simple. It's another prefixes cannot be changed. And then, well, it kind of depends. We want a critical strike chance modifier. It's very important that it's the critical strike chance, not the global critical strike multiplier, because the critical strike chance is local. And because of that, it scales the base crit strike of your, of your weapon by that of your minions. And the thing is, two versions of this, right? You'd either do Reforge Crit, or you could do Add Remove Crit. Both have a 10% chance of giving you the modifier you want, which is a tier 1 critical strike chance mod. The difference is that Add Remove is much more expensive. Reforge Crit is essentially just the meta mod cost, so 2 divs and then some, right? Whereas Add Remove is 2 divs for the meta mod, 2 divs for, or 2.5 divs, I guess, for the Life Force, and then another half div or maybe a div for the, the special Life Force. The thing is, the Reforge Crit craft also has a chance of introducing a third modifier, breaking your item in the process, right? So for example, if we were to do this, eventually you're going to roll a third modifier. It's a 10% chance, just like the chance of successfully hitting the mod that we wanted. In this case, we actually got the mod that we wanted before we bricked our item, but it is absolutely possible to get this essentially on the first try, right? Now, obviously, this also depends on your aspirations. For example, for the medium budget version, I went with, I think I ended up with like a tier 3 modifier, which is absolutely fine. Now, if this happens, right, and you break your item, you would have to null. And you might have guessed this is a 50-50 chance, right? We have 2 fractures, which, well, these modifiers cannot be altered anymore. 50 chance of removing a suffix, 50% chance of removing one of the prefixes. This is especially unpleasant if you don't have access to the Fractured Fist mod, because the initial crafting costs are that much higher, right? Because then you have to redo the rolling with essences. You have to introduce the physical damage and chance to impale enemies on hit. Now, I have to be honest here, I actually did this method and I hit right away, which you're going to see in a bit. But it is generally speaking much, much safer to do the add remove. Especially, as I said before, if you have to roll for this modifier, do not do Reforge Crit. It is way too expensive, because 10% chance of breaking the item also means that you have a 10% chance of having to do the entire craft again. Now, since you can annul, and 50% of the annuls recover your item into a craftable state again, technically it's a 5% chance to break your item, right? Or 10% chance to break it, 50% chance to unbreak it, right? Doesn't really matter how you frame it. The much safer way is to do add remove. The thing is, there are more costs that I didn't mention, because when you want to do add remove, every time after you've introduced a modifier, you have to scour the item, right? Of course, always, put prefixes cannot be changed on the item first, right? You don't want to actually scour all of the mods, just the suffixes. The good thing is this is deterministic in the sense that the only thing that can ever happen is you introducing a critical modifier. Could be critical strike chance, could be critical, crit multi, but you can never break your item at any point in time. And the chance of successfully introducing the modifier is also the exact same, so 10%. Still very expensive, but it has the advantage of never having a chance to break your item, which I personally think is more sensible. I was a bit reckless, honestly, when I was crafting mine, but this isn't something I can really recommend, right? For obvious reasons. Now, of course, I'm getting a bit unlucky here. Should have hit eventually by now. Now, you don't have to get like a tier 1 crit modifier, right? It is what you want. I mean, sometimes you just get unlucky. I mean, this just happens every now and then. Very obnoxious when it is on like in this step of the crafting process, because this one is very expensive for obvious reasons, right? Add remove isn't cheap. Okay. I get, like, personally, I would stop crafting here. The extra, like, 3% critical strike chance are not really worth it. Again, this is very unlikely, though. Well, it's like a 10% chance of hitting. This is bullshit right now, but it happens. And the last step is fairly simple, honestly. The last step is simply crafting chance to deal double damage, and that's pretty much the craft. Now, you could do some crazy shenanigans, right? You could go for double corrupt implicit. There are some implicits that are somewhat interesting, right? Attack speed, critical strike chance, right? Personally, the fist damage modifiers, they don't really do anything for me, but I guess critical strike chance and attack speed to some degree, right? There's also momentum support, which is kind of weird. I'm not sure it actually works for the clones. PoE seems to think it does. Haven't really tried it that much. Is it worth it? No, right? Like, double corruptions are insane. They just have a way, like, the chance of them bricking your item are, like, way too high, right? On average, you're not getting anything out of it. The second most common example is your item being deleted or just being altered, right? Actually getting the modifiers that you want is very unlikely. And I don't think this is ever worth it. So I can't really recommend this at all. Okay, so this is pretty much it for the bow. As I said, don't double corrupt it. I don't think it's worth it. This is expensive enough as it is. Sadly, there's nothing else that compares to this. The next best bow is, I don't know, it's probably the medium budget version of this craft, honestly, right? With like a tier 3 modifier here, or tier 4 modifier here, right? And then I don't know, like a tier 3 or tier 4 crit modifier here, and then using any physical damage modifier here, like lowering the tiers of your modifiers, in this case having a slightly different physical modifier, is much more sensible than using a different type of bow. Because even the best physical bow line ice it's nowhere near that in terms of damage, right? But yeah, that's that for the bow. For the quiver craft is much simpler, much more pleasant, really deterministic, as long as we start out with a very specific fracture that I'm going to show you in a second. Usually the attack speed is optimal in terms of damage, but if you want to start out with a different base, that is also okay, right? Let's say you're crafting this for a different type of build, right? We do have to start out with an item level 86 here. This is important because some of the modifiers actually require that level. In terms of the fracture, you want to start out with one of these fractured damage to attacks modifier. It is imperative that you do so. If you don't do it, the prefixes are pretty much uncraftable later on. For my build, I went with a physical damage. This was relatively cheap. Now, I have no idea what these go by right now, but I think I paid like a diff or so for mine. So that's nothing that is like crazy in terms of costs. The next step is fairly simple, right? After turning it rare, you want to roll the item with Essences of Zeal. And we're doing that in order to get a specific modifier, the critical strike multiplier with bows. It's important that you get the critical strike multiplier with bows, not the critical strike chance. The tier 1 should take you around 30, 40 rolls or so, maybe a bit more, if we're getting as lucky as I did on the bowcraft, right? But it's not too bad if you started with a tier 2, for example, to cut costs. Now, there is something that's important here. We do need an open suffix, right? Which means that if you end up with a third suffix, which happens a lot, you need to annul it. Now, this is another one of those reasons why it's actually sensible to not be hyper fixated on tier 1, right? The difference between tier 1 and tier 2 is really not that big. And you're going to have to do this multiple times. Obviously, every time I do here, you have to redo the craft, right? I'm just a bit too lazy to do that right now. And once we end up with a weapon that looks like this, a quiver that looks like this, all we have to do is we have to craft cannot roll attack modifiers, and then we add modifiers, prefixes, with exalted orbs. And the only two modifiers that can be rolled are maximum life and increased damage with bow skills. And the good thing is we can also remove them again, deterministically, because these two modifiers here, they have attack tags. Technically these three, but this one is fractured anyway. So the only thing you can remove are the prefixes and your meta mod. Make sure that if you remove the meta mod by accident, to put it back on right away, because once you lose the meta mod, you can actually remove the suffixes as well, right? Which you don't want. But once you've done that, all you have to do is slam those exalts, hope for good modifiers. Yeah, that's pretty much my quiver, as you're going to see in a second. I think I ended up with like tier 1 critical strike multi, but I think I also had 2 tier 2 prefixes. For 2 tier 1s, you're going to have to do this quite a bit. Personally, I don't think it's really worth it. It's like, I don't know, 4 or 5% damage with bow skills and maybe like 10 life or so. Nothing to write home about. This is what I did. Obviously, you want to replace the meta mod at the end of the crafting with frenzy charge on critical strike and increased global critical strike chance. And yeah, that's pretty much the craft. As I said before, this works for any type of build, right? It doesn't have to be physical damage, right? It can be lightning, can be chaos, can be cold, can be fire, it doesn't matter. The quiver is much more approachable than the bow. Obviously, the crafting cost of this quiver is maybe, I don't know, like 10, 20 diffs or so. Whereas for the bow, it's more like 50 to 100. To keep your crafting cost low, I do recommend not overshooting with modifiers. And if you wanna actually get all tier 1s, then absolutely do add remove crit. As you're going to see in a second, I didn't do that, and I got lucky, but it's not reliable, right? So if you're crafting the bow, do add remove. Do as I say, not as I do. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to get to them as soon as I can. If you want to connect with me or my community, you can find my socials including Twitch, Discord, and Patreon in the description of this video or on my channel page. I hope you liked it. I'm going to leave you with the in-game crafting of the 2 items. Until next time.
Cool winds. Keep your eyes sharp.